what should the government be doing? What isn't the government doing? What can Congress do about it? Let's start with you, Congressman Pocan.
Yeah, so good morning, everybody. First of all, let me just say I started with the county board. That's why I'm like knocking things over now on top of this. Mike and I were having a nice reminiscence about some of the interesting times we had on the county board, where after every meeting we did kind of get out and go out together, and how things used to operate and how I wish they still kind of operated at different levels of government. But really enjoyed my time at the county board. And one of the things I'm sure you're worried about is your county health departments and what's going to go on with all the costs on things. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. Last week we had Secretary Azar before the committee. This week we have the NIH tomorrow before the committee. Next week we have CDC and FDA before the committee. So it's a good time to be kind of checking in on what's happening. I think there's a difficulty because of the way it's happening so fast for people to really keep up with it, but I think also there's some things that we could be doing a lot better. I personally, and as mentioned this to Jim and Jenny, have been following Scott Gottlieb, the first FDA commissioner under President Trump. I had a lot of respect for Scott Gottlieb, worked with him very closely because we had oversight over the FDA. I've been following his Twitter feed, and you might want to do that, because I think you get some pretty unadulterated information about what's going on, good and bad. But there's some troubling spots around testing. I think the goal was to get to 1,000 tests by the end of the month in a nation of 335 million people. That's probably not real good. And we officially now have taken testing off the numbers we keep track of. That's probably not good. So there's a few things they're doing that I think make me a little worried. I do think this week, hopefully, we will have before Congress the appropriations to deal with this. The President proposed, I think, about $2.5 billion. I don't think we have the exact number yet, but my guess is it's going to be somewhere in the north of $7 billion is what we need to at least have right now. And even that may not be enough. We don't really exactly know, and I think it is an evolving sort of issue. But I think for your concern, and one of the things we're watching is making sure that the local and state health departments also are seeing some resources, because you're going to have some that incur. I'll tell you what Scott Gottlieb said over the weekend, and I think is significant. He says likely hundreds, if not thousands, of people already have coronavirus in the United States. We just don't know because we're not doing the testing. And I think from the briefings you had, sounds like you're hearing some of the same. It's going to be much more prevalent before we really get to figuring exactly out what we need to do. There's not a lot of money for quarantine. There's a lot of things that aren't happening yet. So I'll stop it at that, other than we're talking to a lot of departments right now. I think everyone is in good faith on the various agencies trying to do things, but I think there has been a fumbled ball or two. And I think when we focus on the stock market rather than the health crisis, I think by focusing on the health crisis, you will focus on the stock market. So I hope we focus that as a health issue first and foremost. And then I think Mike will tell you about a bill he just put out, and I appreciate him reaching out to us. We're doing it in a bipartisan way, but we're also trying to keep track of various potential shortages, whether it be of prescription drugs, medical devices, active ingredients for stuff. If you got a question about that, I'll give you a long story later, but I'm not going to keep going right now. But there's a lot moving right now, and there's a lot we don't know.
Okay, Congressman Gallagher, yes, you can talk about the bill that you and Congressman Pocan are on to strengthen the medical supply chain, but how do you think the government's responding, and what can Congress do?
Well, I think I was kind of screaming at the outset 3 weeks ago that we needed a targeted travel ban. I'm glad that we did that, but I was thinking as I was flying here on Sunday night, and I was just overhearing the conversation in the row behind me. There was one person who was hacking almost uncontrollably. I'm like, all right, great, I'm gonna get coronavirus. And then the lady 2 seats away from her was talking about how she just took a red eye from Japan. And I'm like, it is almost impossible to contain something like this in a globalized economy where everyone's flying all over the world, particularly with a disease like this where it's not the so-called R0 rate, sort of measures how easily it can spread. It's not as high as measles, but you know, it's pretty high, right? For every one person that's infected, they're going to infect a little over 2 people. So travel bans have limited utility, and I think the focus needs to be on individual and community resilience. But when the dust settles on all this, I think we are going to realize just how fragile our supply chains are, right? To some extent, this is a acute illustration of a bigger problem that we've realized belatedly over the last 3 to 5 years, which is to say we made a massive bet on integrating China into the global economy in 2001 when they acceded to the WTO. We got a lot of cheap stuff as a result of that. We all got fat and happy off that cheap stuff, but our supply chains are very, very fragile. And that's true certainly when it comes to our medical supply chains. It's also true when it comes to critical national security technology, a lot of which has a pathway back to Beijing. And if there is a silver lining in all of this, my hope is that it's going to send a signal to the market that concentrating a lot of your manufacturing in China is probably not the best long-term strategy for survival and growth. And that's why I'm glad Mark and I were able to reach across the aisle and introduce the Medical Supply Chain Security Act, which would give the FDA authority to tell certain medical device manufacturers and drug manufacturers, you need to alert us if your supply chain in China or wherever is going to produce a shortage of critical medicine or a critical device like an N95 respirator. So it's crises like this that I think really test the resilience of our healthcare system in Wisconsin, but also nationally. We're lucky to have, the most advanced and best healthcare system in the world, but it does have serious weaknesses and deficiencies. And so my hope is that just as you have two people who don't share the same political ideology trying to work together, the rest of our colleagues will be able to kind of work together on this crisis and not just use it as a sort of cheap talking point to score political points.
Yeah, Jeff, if there could be a silver lining that comes out of a conversation like this right now, the other thing is the supply chains got away from us, right? Too many people are producing things in China and not here in America, and especially around active ingredients. In some drug classes, 90% of the active ingredients you need to make a drug, no matter where it's made, are made in China. And we're not tracking active ingredient shortages right now, but we're tracking some drug shortages, and we're not tracking the medical device shortages, which is why we have a bill to try to start tracking that. And when I asked Secretary Azar this question, I didn't like my answer, and Secretary Azar used to be in the pharmaceutical industry, but his answer was, well, the difference of cost could be literally a penny a pill, and that's a lot to the pharmaceutical industry. When I think of the Hep C drug, which is $1,000 a pill, and you have to take for 90 days in a row, is a penny worth losing the supply chain that you can have by having it made in the United States? So hopefully, one of the things that comes out of this is there's a great book called China RX, if you want to read about this particular issue. And I just finished it on vacation, which is really another problem. We can talk about that later. Actually, I do. I have it on my desk. I'll be glad to. It's from the library, too, of Congress. But it's a really, a book that, should make everyone nervous about what's out there. But that's why I asked the question Friday at the briefing about active ingredients, because if we're not tracking that, you're really not tracking drug shortages. So the good news is, this is what you hear from Democrats and Republicans. On appropriations, there are as many Republicans who ask about the drug supply chain as Democrats. So this is kind of bringing us together to deal with the issue. I think now we got to figure out how to bring the industry and bring folks back in to kind of also say, is it really worth a penny a pill to be risking potential shortages? Because it's not just whether or not you're manufacturing something in the Wuhan province. At some point, China could very likely say, okay, any drugs manufactured here are staying here for internal use first, and then we're out of luck. Or why don't we have more test kits? Because so many things are produced in other places. Like, there's a lot, I think, that's coming out of this that's going to be very interesting.
Okay, so the original theme of this discussion was going to be Congress after impeachment, but coronavirus got in the way. But anyway, so you two, have a working relationship, but it seems like often that a lot of Congress and members of Congress don't. So what is the mood in Congress? How would you typify what the mood is?
I sort of think there are kind of two simultaneous, I want to say games, but for lack of a better word, I'll say games, playing out on any given day in Congress. And Mark has far more experience than I do, so maybe has a different view of the world. But there's kind of what you see when you turn on the TV and the various presidential candidates are sparring with Trump, and then various leaders in Congress are sparring with each other, and then you kind of have a cable news ecosystem that rewards and incentivize kind of the loudest voices sometimes. That's sort of one level of the game. But then there's kind of the day-to-day of what's happening in Congress. And I would submit that even in a very divided Congress, even into Congress where very recently we went through impeachment, which was a divisive issue, where every day we get closer to the 2020 election, there's less incentive to work on productive legislation. Notwithstanding those factors, on a day-to-day, there are people in Congress that want to get stuff done. And it's not only because they view that as the reason they're in Congress, but also they want to deliver for their constituents, right? Because, it's not just presidents that are on the ballot in 2020, it's all of us. So I think the mood, I don't know, maybe there's kind of two different moods simultaneously, but just for example, for the last year really, my life has been consumed by this outside commission that I'm chairing on U.S. cyber policy, and I co-chair it with an independent senator from Maine, Angus King, who's become a really good friend. And similar to how Mark and I work, while we don't agree on everything, on this issue we've been able to put aside politics entirely, and so we'll be releasing our final report in the next 2 weeks. So my mood with respect to that is excited. I mean, I'm excited to take this report and kind of get some legislation moving as a result. So I don't know if any of that makes sense, but yeah.
No, it does, Mike. I mean, I look at it this way. There's the good and the bad. Let me give the good first. Unfortunately, the bad is probably a little larger. The good is, with the state delegation, because we are a middle-sized state, if you're a small state, you kind of band together because they have like 1 or 2 members. If you're California and you have 53 members, you may look like the Adams family, but they have 53 members of Congress, right? They can get an awful lot done and they're able to bind together. Medium-sized states have to put the D's and R's aside if we're going to get things done. So we do that largely. If there's something that's important in Mike's district, I'm going to sign a letter, and Mike does the same for me. So that's the good news. I think that helps us punch above our weight class in Wisconsin. And I've had people from Washington and other states say, I wish my state operated that way because we'd get more done. So that's the good. The bad is pretty much everything else. In many ways, it's a pretty broken system. And I can tell you this from being on the county board, where if I wanted to impact change, you could have a very quick effect. Smaller amount of people, but you could have a really quick effect and you could see the influence. I went to the legislature, a little slower, but you could affect a little more people, but the process slowed down. The federal level, as you can imagine, you're affecting more people, but it's really slow. And these days, especially, there is a huge divide between the House and the Senate right now. We have sent over 400 bills, and this is like couple-month-old data. The Senate, 275, which are bipartisan bills. Almost none of them have passed. So when you have some big issues around healthcare, prescription drugs, and other things that are important, we're not seeing the activity that we really need to. And I think that's a disservice for the public. So what winds up happening, and I know Mike hates this, and I know Glenn Grothman is very vocal on this, and I hate this, and I think it's a bipartisan hate, but it's what happens is ultimately a handful of leaders, a couple people on your side, a couple people on my side, in both houses, are deciding omnibus budgets that by the time it gets to us, it's an up or down vote, unamendable, which is very undemocratic and a small. So that's been about a decade of that. And we got to fix that. And if we don't fix that, it really is at our expense of not getting those things done. So I'm hopeful that when we get past the election in 2020, maybe there'll be some opportunities. It has been a bit more polarized in the last 4 than the previous 3 from my perspective. But I just want to get to a point that when you do 12 appropriation bills, those are the 12 appropriation bills. They largely do, a lot of it sticks when you get to the omnibus, but it's just wrong to have these up or down votes unamendable on something a handful of people have done. I mean, we have big county boards, right, in Wisconsin. People want to have that influence on those votes, and we don't have that same impact. And so some of the fighting then from the leadership that you see on TV, and Mike is right, doesn't happen so much at the member level, but it certainly happens because you can sell more detergent by showing people fighting on TV if you have that, rather than saying, hey, Mike and Mark just did a bill. It's a big yawn. You're not selling a lot of Tide at that point. Unfortunately, that is a factor.
Okay, so what are some of the big things do you think can get done in an election year in Congress? What are some of the big things, not necessarily that you folks are going to be personally involved in, but what will Congress do?
Well, I would say I do, not to be too self promotory, if that's a word. I do think we have an opportunity on this Medical Supply Chain Security Act. I mean, it's sort of all the stars are aligned. The Senate companion is Josh Hawley, who's a very conservative senator, but I forget who his Democratic co-sponsor is. But I think it illustrates something which, how do I put this? Regardless of who wins the presidency in 2020, I actually think the new consensus position on foreign policy and national security, and I can tell you this as someone who's spent most of the last 2 decades working in that space, is going to be a very hawkish position on China. And I think that's true if there's a Democratic president, it might be a little less hawkish. Or whether there's, the second term of a Trump administration. In other words, it's not just the fact that Mark and I introduced this bill. It's another example I always bring up is, if you remember, there was a scandal in the NBA. The owner of the Houston Rockets, Daryl Morey, tweeted out something in support of the Hong Kong protesters, and he got a bunch of backlash from the NBA commissioner, a lot of the other owners. They basically muzzled him because, newsflash, the NBA makes a lot of money in China. And so we sent a letter to the NBA commissioner basically criticizing them for that. And just as like one small piece of evidence that what I'm saying is true, the other co-signers of the letter were Tom Cotton and Ted Cruz, very conservative, hawkish senators, and AOC, on the other hand. Like, show me another issue in American politics that can unite all those people. So that's an opportunity, and that's an opportunity for a whole series of legislative vehicles on, how do we improve the way we fund critical national security technology. We want the appropriators to fund something I authorized 2 years ago, the National Security Innovation Capital Fund, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's an opportunity. I think even in some of the more contentious areas like healthcare writ large, there's an opportunity to do things like price transparency. I have a bipartisan bill with a Democrat from Colorado, Ed Perlmutter, on price transparency. Drug pricing transparency, looking at the role of the list price versus the negotiated price, and making sure consumers get the actual negotiated price, the cheaper price. The list goes on, and then my sort of personal hobby horse right now, cyber. We have 75 recommendations in our final report. I'd say about 30 of those are bipartisan bills that are going to be ready to go starting 2 weeks from now. So there's a lot we can do. I guess that's the optimistic case. I can make the pessimistic case.
Let's
I'll let
be
Mark do that.
optimistic. What are some of the big things that could happen?
Yeah, on the big picture, I think the two that, if you took the number of press times that someone in both parties has said they're for the same thing, would be prescription drug prices and infrastructure. The problem is, on infrastructure, you have to pay for it. But obviously, it's very important to everyone in all of our counties, making sure that you're going to see dollars if we're going to do this in infrastructure. There was an agreement between Democratic and Republican leaders and the president several months back around $2 trillion investment. The American Society of Civil Engineers has said we need 4.6 trillion to bring us up to grade, but a $2 trillion agreement. The problem is, when they were supposed to get together and show how they're going to fund it, suddenly talks broke down, the dog ate the homework, and things didn't continue from there. I still think in an election year, this is something the president should want to do. This is something Congress should want to do, so maybe there's ability to get that done. On prescription drug prices, again, the former FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, one of the reasons I liked him so much is, he was great about saying he wanted to get drugs, generic drugs to market quicker. Because if you have one generic, I think it lowers the price of a drug 6%. 2 generic equivalents lower the price 48%. 3 generic equivalents lower the price 66%. So that's one way you can really impact some drug prices. There has been some talk in common. Whether or not that'll get done is another question, given the political environment. But you'd think when you've got drugs like the Hep C drug, it's $1,000 a pill, times 90 days, you have to take it in a row. 95% efficiency, it'll take care of you, but $90,000 expense, suddenly that's a real issue. So we've got to address some of those issues as well. We did pass a bill out of the House. I think there could be a Senate, their own version of a bill coming, and that could bring you to conference on that. So I'm still thinking that could happen. And on the smaller side, but you're right, I want to be a little more optimistic than maybe I sometimes can be when I talk about Congress. I serve on the Modernization Committee. It's an evenly split committee of Dems and Republicans. Nothing gets a vote out of there unless you have 2/3 of the vote. We've already sent a bunch of recommendations. We're going to be sending a bunch more. But maybe even just improving how we operate, modernizing us from the beepers that some people still have to know when things are happening. We just need to have a system that works a little better. That committee has been very valuable. It was supposed to last for a year. Congress as a whole gave it another year extension. So I think at the end of the day, we'll have some good results coming out of there.
Can I ask, so I stole an idea from Mark on changing the schedule for Congress, and then I put it in a big article that got me in trouble with a lot of people. But it's basically this idea that this sort of process through which we fly in Sunday night and then we leave Thursday morning and then we're also flying back and forth is not the most efficient process. And so you might want to keep us here for 2 weeks and then we go home for 2 weeks, or I would say 3 and 1, but is that, what's the, I know you're probably not allowed to reveal this.
Yeah, so actually, William Timmons, a Republican freshman, and I have been the leader on the committee on it. Unfortunately, my leadership, and I believe your leadership, hates it because they want to control us, and they can control us better if they keep us on planes all the time and we can't talk to each other. So the idea that Mike and I like, which is instead of these 4-day weeks with a fly-in day and a fly-out day, and it takes me sometimes 14 hours to get to work, which I could drive quicker than flying, but I get to explore lots of airports in the country. I have 2 work days during that week, so clearly it's not especially productive. The plan that I had, and I really appreciate Mike, as well adopting the idea, and it should be bipartisan. It should be nonpartisan. Is have 5-day work weeks where you fly in on a Monday and work all day Friday. Start that following Monday right away, but have 2 weeks in a row. It gives you more floor time. And you might stay over on the weekend and get to know each other. God forbid. What would happen, Mike, if that happened? Like, right, the reason we were friends and are friends is because we did that after every county board meeting. That doesn't happen enough. That could happen. And then you're in your district for 2 weeks so that you're making sure you're hearing what's going on in every corner of your district and bringing it back to Washington.
Yeah,
Leadership hates
staff
that.
would love that, I think, if you're
Actually,
gone for 2 weeks.
DC staff would really, I know, I think Glenn's here somewhere. He would
Glenn
be
would say
very-
yes,
yeah.
all right, yeah. Glenn likes this idea. All right, before we go to audience questions, the infrastructure thing seems like a total no-brainer. I mean, Trump talked about that. Democrats have talked about that. Republicans have talked about that in Congress. It's sort of like, well, I think the county folks would love to have money coming from the feds to repair aging infrastructure. Why can't that get done?
Honestly, it's the finding where you're going to get the funds to do it, right? That's where talks broke down. And as you can imagine, it's anything like you're dealing with as well. The thing is, coming from county board originally, what you don't want to happen is us to come up with brilliant ideas and not funding, and then the state passes these brilliant ideas with no funding, and then you're stuck with brilliant ideas and no place to get the funding. So we don't want that to happen, but there are ways, I think, that you could do it. There's a lot of different things I think you could point to and how to try to raise some serious dollars. But whether or not you can get consensus between the two, I think that's the more difficult part. Everyone agrees, I mean, yeah, you've got to invest in our infrastructure, but talks did fall apart when it came to the finding of funding.
I just would add, well, first, Mark's right to suggest it all comes down to how do you pay for it, right? And we have a lot of different priorities out there, defense, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. Infrastructure week has become a running joke because, it's the thing that you wait to the last second to prioritize, and then it never gets prioritized. So, I mean, the basic math problem is that the gas tax is losing its utility, and that's part of that's a good story, right? Vehicles are becoming more fuel efficient. VMT, there's a lot of skepticism around vehicle miles traveled. People don't want their cars tracked and things like that. So we're looking for there are limited levers you can pull to raise $2 trillion worth of money. I would say there's some disagreement about the $2 trillion figure. There's some disagreement about how that's calculated and the people that calculate that, so that's part of the problem. Additionally, though, I think we have to look at the incentives through which we fund infrastructure. There's an argument that I've become convinced of that oftentimes we prioritize the building of new things. New projects tend to capture the imagination. They bring out the worst in politicians because politicians want to be there at the ribbon cutting. There's no ribbon cutting when you're like repairing a road that's 20 years old, but the most of what we need to do is repair and maintain what we have before we start building fancy new projects, and the incentives don't often point in that direction. And so infrastructure is really complicated. I'm on the infrastructure committee. It's fun, but yeah, I'd be lying if I said tomorrow we're going to come up with an agreement.
Okay, but the federal gas tax has not been increased in what, 25, 30 years? So that could,
93,
even if you have,
96.
But I would add, it's also more than just, the road structure, right? It's broadband. I mean, I started a real broadband caucus, bipartisan. Everyone wanted to be a co-chair. We have 3 co-chairs from each party. 6 co-chairs is probably the most I've seen of any caucus, but
Yeah.
everyone wanted to be a co-chair because everyone's got that problem. But we need to invest in that because the companies won't on their own. We got to invest in schools, right? There's some housing issues around infrastructure, roads and bridges, your traditional harbors, et cetera. But it is broader. So I think part of that $2 billion figure, and I agree, is probably not great consensus among leadership there was, but maybe not by the folks who are going to vote. But it covers a lot more than just the roads and bridges, which is why a gasoline tax would cover some of it, but it doesn't, you can't necessarily use a gasoline tax money for broadband build out.
Yeah. It's interesting. I've focused a lot on kind of the future of the internet and 5G over the last year. I do a lot of kind of China tech, US competition stuff. But, we're so spun up about 5G, and we should be, right? I mean, this is going to be the backbone of the digital economy. It's critical. We can't have the Chinese Communist Party dominate the future of the internet, but there's some rural areas in Wisconsin, they don't have 4G. Like, it's just not, it's going to be a problem in urban areas, and rural broadband's a huge issue. Now, there's some promising technology, some really innovative companies like SpaceX could potentially use low Earth orbit satellites to beam, not like the highest speed internet, but decent internet to rural areas, but it's a difficult issue. And I think if we can get it right, it might solve this other problem we have in Wisconsin of, some of these towns, I mean, Green Bay has a hard enough time competing for top level talent, particularly tech talent. I mean, let alone, like, look at Seymour or Kewanee. Like, how do we keep people there, convince people to move there? And, if you have fast internet and the amenities that come with that, that could be one small piece of that puzzle.
All right, let's go to some audience questions here, and just, there you go, raise your hand and shout it out. Go ahead, you're all ready to go.
I'm Tom Snyder. Mike, first of all, I want to thank you very much for signing on to the CVSO Act. I really appreciate that. And I'll be in your office, I think, noon, and I'll talk to Kevin about naming it.
Okay.
Did he talk with you about that?
Not yet.
Okay.
What
We
should I
have
know?
a young combat medic from New London who went off with his buddies and was prepared to sew them up and put Band-Aids on. But he used to call his mom and say, I wasn't prepared for bandaging women and children.
Sure.
And he killed himself 2 days before he was going to report to the VA to get help.
Yeah.
And if we can attach a name like that,
Okay.
it's called the Josh Nieto, and I'll talk to Kevin about it. But
Great.
again, thank you from the bottom of my heart for signing on to that. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I guess we should have mentioned, I do think veterans issues too are an area where the Congress continues to work together. For example, on the Armed Services Committee, I signed on to my colleague Anthony Brown, who I hate because he has the shortest commute of anybody. I think he lives like 15 minutes away. Meanwhile, I spent half my life trapped in O'Hare, getting coronavirus. He had a bill where you change your DD-214, the form you get when you get out of the military, and just to allow you to put your email address on it, right? As opposed to some outdated landline that you no longer use in case someone wants to get in touch with you later on. So all sorts of little things in the veteran space that make a difference.
Bill, Larry is beating you to the punch, and then we'll go to Bill. Go ahead, Larry.
So 12, 13 years ago, it seems to me one of the ways that Congress worked better was when there was earmarks before they were demonized, because like in Waukesha, we were trying to get money to help with our efforts for Great Lakes water. We got help from Senator Cole and Congressman Sensenbrenner, and it seemed like it was a good way for people like both of you to say, I know of a good project in my district, and I'm going to, Mark will support what's in Mike's and vice versa, and then it was demonized because of the Bridge to Nowhere. And I just wonder if you guys have thoughts on that. Could that ever come back? Because it seems like you've lost the ability to trade off or target where federal funds are needed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I serve on appropriations, and if we bring back earmarks, I wouldn't complain. How's that, Jim? Is that a Kenosha way of addressing? Thank you. So there's no question. I've asked Republicans who've been around for a while, when John Boehner was Speaker, could he have had a more productive session if they had earmarks? Because there are plenty of people who want to be pure and can vote no, but when they have something for their district, in a budget that's reasonable, they would vote yes. And there's no question that would have made things operate much better. Getting rid of them, I think, is a universally appreciated mistake. The problem is it's still kind of being weaponized a little bit. So when we tried to bring it back, the Republican leadership was kind of like playing an interesting dance. So there is, though, a possible path through the Modernization Committee. We are looking right now at congressionally directed spending with and this isn't all out there, and I know there's media here, so I'm probably going to get in trouble, but
Yes,
I'm used to
you're
that.
on the record, Mark.
I know, but we are looking at a potential path of something that would be very, very specific. And for people in this room, you'd be happy because it would be going to government entities only, so no private firm. Probably not nonprofits, but you'd be very transparent. Your name would be attached to it. You'd be putting together some of the data for us. We would be presenting, but there would be an ability to have a say. You know more than a Washington bureaucrat does about Waukesha County. Therefore, you and Jim Sensenbrenner should be able to work on some of those things together. And I think there is bipartisan consensus, with maybe one exception out of the entire Modernization Committee, maybe two, that think this is a good path to try to move forward. So we are trying to look at it, the Appropriations Committee as well as looking at something like that. But I think if you get more narrow on where the money can go, full transparency, so that you're not doing something like a bridge to nowhere. By the way, I spoke to a group once and made that reference, and someone raised their hand. They're like, I'm the staff person who wrote the bridge to nowhere. So I try to be a little careful now when I do that, but no question, if you could do that, not only is it right for the institution, because Mike knows more about Northeast Wisconsin than anyone, so he should be able to help direct that and help with your help getting that done. And I think I know more about South Central, Southwestern Wisconsin, and I should be able to help direct that. And if we are able to do that, I think it helps everyone then be able to get the process moving again. So, sorry I'm talking about it
No,
long.
that's all right.
but-
So Congressman Gallagher, how does that, bringing back legislative report, fit into your reform agenda?
I was hoping I wouldn't have to comment on this. So I think Mark's right to suggest that. So I came into Congress in 2016. When we were having this debate, I think it was the first meeting I ever went to. It was our rules debate, and at the time I'm like, this seems like a terrible idea. The first thing we're gonna do is bring back earmarks. Like, that's a horrible. After a president just got elected, talking about draining the swamp all the time. So I'm sensitive to the political nature of it. However, you're right to suggest that all earmarks did, getting rid of earmarks did, was effectively transfer the power of the purse from the legislative branch to the executive branch. Like, we didn't actually drain the swamp by getting rid of earmarks. So in my mind, without being an expert on this or an appropriator, and I wear that as a badge of honor, there's got to be a way to bring that power back to where it constitutionally should reside, while guarding against the excesses of earmarks. And I think having someone's name attached to it would go that way. My predecessor, Reed Ribble, suggested something like, if you required a vote at an amendment gets a vote for every earmark, that it could guard against it. But to me, there's got to be a way you could strike the balance. I'd be lying to you if I said I knew what that was.
Yeah, I think the problem was that they got buried, and then they were discovered later, and then you couldn't track who did it and all that. I mean,
and one of the things, and this has been very helpful from the Republican side on this discussion, was, what you don't want to have happen is just right now Democrats are in charge. And you don't want, if there's a project and on one side of the district there's a Republican member, they don't support the project, the other side the Democrat does, that shouldn't be necessarily a go just because Democrats are in charge, right? Because that's going to shift back and forth. So we got things like that we're looking at for language in there too. So I think there's a path to do this in a responsible way that I hope will have bipartisan support, and I think will make the process run better. But honestly, I think it was one of the biggest mistakes that happened that made things the most dysfunctional back in 2010. And I hope that we can, as a Congress, regain that constitutional authority to do that, but do it in a responsible way. Otherwise, we're going to wind up right back in the same place. So I can't guarantee it at this point. It certainly is a discussion, but I think a pretty good discussion right now.
I think you should do it while Democrats are in charge. That's my.
Thank you.
all right, Bill.
Mike, in your creates all kinds of problems. So how are you addressing
Yeah.
that?
So I have to be careful because this is all embargoed until next Tuesday. So I may talk around this, but yes, we will be. And right now, actually, Angus is at the Center for Strategic International Studies giving a talk on election security and previewing some of our proposals. But I think it's fair to say we will come out with proposals to fix the gridlock that the Election Commission currently has based on the makeup of that commission. We will argue for robust funding, not only from the top down, but more importantly from the bottom up, because part of the problem in just throwing money at the problem of cybersecurity in the context of an election is that it's entirely dependent on the state officials and the unique structure through which different states do their elections. And so some are good, some are very bad and open to attack. And all it takes is, you know, the Russians or the Chinese or whoever targeting like 3 critical counties across the United States to throw things into complete disarray. But there are some great nonprofits who operate with the very unique makeup in each state and county that we have worked with, and we have recommendations on how to improve their work. But at the end of the day, I've come to believe that the best way to secure our elections, and this is ironic as someone who's chairing a cyber commission, is to have paper ballots or an auditable paper trail. And so it's kind of like the Back to the Future approach to.
That's my bill that we included in the Democratic, 2 different bills we put out there.
Yeah.
I mean, at least you have, and you've done these before. I've done them for county board races. I've done the hand recount. You can at least do it with a paper ballot. People have the confidence that their ballot the first time is working, and if not, there's a process to have. So that would be great if we could just even
You
get
want to go back
that
to when
far.
the boxes of ballots get missing, is that?
No, you just want to get back to at least you have a verifiable paper trail, which with some of the touchscreen machines, you just don't. And when you have had as much information, and Mike gets a lot more in the Intel arena, when you know how much they can impact the companies that make these machines and things, you know, we do have to have that in place.
But here's the thing, I mean, it's just like, you know, our elections depend on individual voters making informed choices. I mean, the security of our election system depends on individual voters not falling victim to misinformation that's online, right? And you can imagine a scenario in which there are Russian bots or whatever bots telling people, well, don't go vote at this area or that area because there's a risk of a coronavirus outbreak there, right? There's all sorts of ways in 2020 where you can mess around, and it requires sort of digital and cyber literacy of every single voter, and that's a harder thing to fix from Washington, D.C.
All right, other questions out there? Go ahead, man. Go ahead.
I'm from Calumet County. First of all, I've got to put in
This
this.
is my favorite table right here.
Put in this statement for my board chair about she would like the school lunch program to return the fruits and vegetables and the multi-grains that were taken out. The other thing is from me is I represent several villages, and basically all the fire departments in our county are volunteer fire departments. And one of the villages I believe are going to be contacting you is that I believe it's the National Fire Safety dictates when a fire truck has to be repurchased, or the town village clerk told me even the tires when they have to be purchased, and as we all know, those pieces of equipment are very costly. So because they go out on so few fire calls versus a professional fire department, there was wondering if there could be some sort of exemption for the small volunteer. I was just doing count. In our county, we've got at least 8 volunteer fire departments. And we're a county of 50,000 people. So,
Okay.
so there's my plug for that one.
I was-
And I still do a paper ballot, by the
There
way.
you go.
Our village
Yeah.
does paper ballots.
Good. Well, I was unaware of the issue, but I look forward to
Okay, and you
hearing
will
it.
be receiving
Yeah.
a letter they sent
Yeah.
from, yes, so,
Great, thank you.
Okay, we had a question over here? Tom Levy, wow.
Well, I'm from Dane County, so my question's about grass. No, but all joking aside, how serious are the conversations that you guys have about taxing marijuana now that's legal in 27 states? And we got, you know, financial needs of the DOD and the IC and MA and infrastructure. Is that looked at in any serious way about a new revenue stream?
Yeah, I think in the same way, some people, not many, but some have beepers still to know when they have to vote, even though we have phones and everything else. That's where Congress is on the issue of marijuana. How many states have a legal product and you still can't put your money in the bank legally is ridiculous, right? But that's how we operate on it in general. A part of it, I think, honestly, is in the Senate, Chuck Grassley, you know, every time they have a judicial appointment, federal appointment, he asks them if they've ever smoked marijuana. If they do, he says he's going to turn them down. How can you do that now when you have states that it's legal? I mean, so we are just really backwards on this subject, and you all are going to be dealing with this way before we are. So by the time we get our heads around it, you're probably going to have most of it figured out. But I have been very disappointed just, I mean, as a small business owner, I visited one of the dispensaries that they came to our Democrat caucus, and I went and visited them when I was in the city there, and they can't even deduct their employees' salaries as a expense of doing business. I've been a small business owner for 3 decades. Like, if I can't deduct my salaries as a expense of doing business, it's a very difficult business to be in. And yet that's exactly the point for all these folks in so many places, in places like Colorado, California, but Colorado especially, how much money they're making for schools and other projects is pretty significant. But I think federally we are way, way behind on this.
Well, also Wisconsin's going to be an island.
Very likely. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
Oh. I confess I'm actually a little bit torn on this issue. On the one hand, we do have to rectify this weird imbalance we have between federal law and state law. I mean, the idea that states have legalized it, but it's a controlled substance federally, those two things don't add up, right? It actually sort of makes a mockery of federal law, if you think about it. As a conservative, in general, tie always goes to the states. However, I am not sanguine about the effects of marijuana. I'm going to piss off a lot of people in this room. And I know I'm supposed to be a young member of Congress, even though I turned 36 today, so it's all downhill from here.
We can boo him for that. We can boo him for that.
You've now offended the entire...
I know.
But marijuana is not good for you. It's not good for our children. I understand there are medical uses, I got it, but I just don't want to create an environment where it is easier for our kids to get addicted to another substance. And there are already enough problems with alcohol. We're already all addicted to the devices we carry around in our pockets, and we're becoming lazier and stupider as a result. And we can't beat the Chinese if the next generation is lazy and stupid. So I have very simplistic and torn feelings on the issue. So if it were a state decision, I would oppose it at the state level. But I take Mark's points, and I do think we have to rectify this imbalance between the state and the federal government.
Okay, go ahead.
Representative Gallagher went to your water summit.
Was that the one where I had I was late?
No, it was.
Yeah.
But well, sorry you were late, but the event was really good.
We fly through O'Hare. We had this great event we were planning for months, and 3 flights I had got canceled, and so I got there with 10 minutes to spare, so I apologize.
All the people that were there were awesome. My question to you though is, our water quality in Wisconsin continues to decline, particularly with misuse of ag, I think. I mean, that seems to be the dominant percentage of problem. We have other issues that impact it. But I'm wondering, at the federal level, EPA is continuing to remove protective policies. And I don't know if you want to comment on
Sure.
that. Or
Why don't you try to repeat the question so everybody can...
So the question was about our water quality in Wisconsin. Northeast Wisconsin in particular continues to decline, and what's the path forward if EPA continues to sort of loosen up the regulatory environment? Actually, one bright spot, I would say, in a divided Congress, to connect this where we started, was I was one of, I think, 10 or 20 Republicans to vote for a bill that I know Mark was in support of, the PFAS Action Act, which would require the EPA to designate PFAS and PFOA as hazardous substance, open up access to Superfund, do a variety of other things that are necessary, because certainly in my neck of the woods, in Peshtigo, we've seen the devastating impact that hazardous chemicals have had on the local community. So that's one good thing we're doing. In an area where I can disagree with some of my colleagues and certain people in the executive administration, that's fine, because we are not a co-equal branch of government. We are the dominant branch of government. The phrase co-equal branch of government is a fiction that entered our lexicon in the late 1960s. It was a ploy by Richard Nixon to elevate the executive branch relative to the legislative branch. The framers envisioned a legislative leviathan. So just throwing that out there. I digress. Also, at the local level, that water summit really came out of effort that my predecessor started with Save the Bay. We've had a lot of, I think, really responsible dairy farmers who've recognized that this is an issue and want to be at the leading edge of being responsible stewards of the local environment. And I think in Wisconsin, we have an opportunity to kind of lead the way in terms of what our best practices in terms of cover crops, digesters, dewatering, and what is the balance between supporting our ag industry and making sure we continue to lead the world in dairy while also preserving what is our greatest gift, which is just the beauty and health of our state.
Representative Pocan, in your district, there's well water contamination, and so this, and your friend, Speaker Voss, convened something at the state level to take a look at this, which is really a bipartisan effort there at the state level. So I guess I'm wondering how you see all this playing out, because the water quality issue is definitely something crossing party lines.
Yeah, I mean, this is one area where, I guess if I have one of my greater critiques of the Trump administration is, no one likes regulations, right? And it's easy to attack regulations, but some of those regulations actually protect people, especially when it comes to something like air or water. And on water side, I think, the EPA is going a little too far in with what they've been doing, some of the deregulation, and because of it, we're having more issues, I think, in the communities. What we don't want to happen is have Flint, Michigans everywhere. We don't want to have a lot of the ag land. One of my most rural counties are the ones that have the worst water quality issues right now. This is one area that we're having a hard time. A lot of these things are not done legislatively. They're done by executive order by the president, and there's not much we can do if you can't get a House and a Senate to agree to stand up. So I think we are in a bad place right now in this area.
And so the answer is action at the state level?
You know what, honestly, you're right, action should always happen anyway, and I think Mike is at the local level. You guys are able to do things, and states are able to do things that can show us then the path, because we are, to call us sloth-like would be an insult to sloths, I think, at the federal level in how we operate. But if you can do some best practice stuff, you can then set examples for us to be able to take a look at. So, often I look around the country and some of the best ideas are coming at the local or state levels. So continue to please, do those sort of things.
Can I say, when it comes to dairy and ag, though, I actually think we've arrived at the right state regulatory and legal framework. I think going forward, the most obvious solution is, it's the pollution, stupid, to paraphrase James Carville. Like, we have to aggressively enforce that and go after polluters. And we have some bad actors in the system that are giving a bad name to people that want to do the right thing. So, I don't know. I do think we have an opportunity there. Sorry.
Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question, and then you guys can bobble this around a little bit. Look, okay, so the presidential race is happening. We got today's Super Tuesday. There's things happening on the Democratic side, big things on the Democratic side, and the presidential primary in Wisconsin is on April 7th. So what do you think is going to happen between now and April 7th? Will April 7th matter in Wisconsin?
They're trying to steal it from Bernie, man. What's going on?
So I have told, every time Mike says this, we're keeping track. I spend one more hour campaigning for him in his district. So I'm going to take him down. By
just
campaigning
saying,
for him.
the establishment Democrats.
I think we're up to about
are
20 hours right now. I got to come and do some work. So, tomorrow I would be a much better pontificator after we finish today. However, Nate Silver, who I think is a good prognosticator by looking at combining all the polls, most recently it's 1 out of 6 chance Bernie Sanders gets nomination, 1 out of 6 chance Joe Biden gets a nomination, 3 out of 6 chance there's no one going into convention, and then everyone else figures out another 6th. that's not a great scenario for me going into a Milwaukee convention. I've talked to Tom Barrett, and he's like, God, if it's not decided, I got to come up with security costs. Of course, a local official's thinking about the practical, what he's got to do, but I'm worried about a lot of other things, what happened if we get to that point. So I think Bernie's going to have a good day today because he was set up in the right states to do well in big states. But because of the 15% threshold rule, having Amy Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg drop out yesterday and endorse him, and Beto O'Rourke endorsed him in Texas, should give him a better ability to pull more delegates than he would have had. That was, the last 48 hours have been huge in the Democratic primary. What's happening, more likely leading us to a convention scenario without a nominee. If Elizabeth Warren, who's going to keep coming in lower, stays in, that's going to hurt Bernie going forward. But I think there's a good chance we could have a convention where we may not have a natural nominee coming in with a 1,991, I think it is the number of delegates you have to have. Worries me because we have a new rule that what used to be super delegates are now called automatic delegates, so we got rid of our capes. And but we vote on the second ballot, and everyone is released from their binding at the second ballot. And there could just be a lot of confusion that comes out of all this. So,
Are you a super delegate?
well, technically, every member of Congress is.
I'm a super
in ours.
delegate.
Yeah, well, we're not super delegates
Oh.
anymore in our party. We're now automatic delegates because we had to fix the problem of super delegates by changing the word. But we also don't vote. We also don't vote on the first round, so there is a significant change too. But it's clear as mud, Jeff, is what I can tell you. Tomorrow morning, maybe a little better idea, but I think.
Buttigieg and Klobuchar drop out, but I mean, the Wisconsin primary is still going to matter.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No matter what it will, because you're likely not going to get to 1991. Every delegate's going to matter. So if you can get one of those 1 in 6 odds versus the 3 in 6, you don't have a nominee. So absolutely, positively, we're the only one that day in Wisconsin. So you'll have lots of visits from the candidates, and it will matter.
Yeah, but this is not, a brokered convention is not a good thing for Democrats.
Did I sound like I thought it was?
So, I mean, that's not the way you want to.
I'll be looking at Milwaukee from Green Bay with popcorn.
Robin Voss's popcorn, I hope.
Right, yeah, he's going to sell out.
Yeah, he's going to sell.
Is it not, and I don't mean this as a knock on political analysis, well, yeah, maybe I do. Isn't it weird that, like, no one knows what the heck's going to happen? Like, for the last, like, I went through this in 2016. I worked for, Walker's campaign, and it went from this to that, and then no one thought Trump was going to win. And then now, last week everyone was saying Biden's dead, it's over. All these people that get paid massive sums of money to tell us what the heck's going to happen in these elections don't know what they're talking about at all. Like, what's going on? Is big data not like something we can leverage here? It's crazy to me.
My favorite is when people go, there's a 50% chance this is going to happen.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
There's also a 50%. They're right, no matter what.
Totally.
Yeah. But Wisconsin will be relevant. You will have candidates coming. The thing is, how many candidates will you have left at that point is the question. If it's, again, after tomorrow morning, I can be much better on this, but I would have to guess now it's Bernie, Biden. I'm not sure Bloomberg is going to stay, or not. We'll see.
He spent a lot of money in Wisconsin.
Well, he spent a lot of money everywhere. I mean, that's going to be a whole a textbook on that. And then whether or not Warren stays in, I mean, if she comes in fourth in a bunch of places, it's hard to justify. But if she does, all those votes are being taken away from Sanders. It may look like that is no different than Klobuchar and Buttigieg endorsing Biden, right? Because it just continues to cause a point where we'll get to a convention without a nominee. So, but we will have a much better idea tomorrow morning.